The morning my wife looked me in the eye, called me a broke loser in front of our neighbors, and threw her wedding ring into the gutter like it was a piece of trash, I did not say a single word in my own defense, because the truth she didn't know was so much bigger than either of us could have imagined in that moment. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet hope that truth always finds its way to the light, I invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. My name is Arthur Whitfield, and for 11 years I lived a life that most people would have called comfortable but unremarkable. I drove a 14-year-old pickup truck with a dent in the rear bumper that I never bothered to fix, I wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and I left our small rented house every morning before sunrise wearing steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice. To anyone driving past our narrow street in the town of Millbrook, I looked exactly like what I claimed to be, a construction site supervisor who came home tired, dusty, and quiet, a man who counted his pennies at the grocery store and apologized every time the power bill came in a little high. What none of them knew, what not even my own wife knew, was that the modest life I lived was a choice, not a circumstance. 15 years earlier, before I ever met Bridget, I had built a small logistics and property software company out of a garage with 2 college friends, and against every possible odd, it had grown into something enormous. By the time I turned 32, I had already sold my shares in that company for an amount of money so large it embarrassed me to say out loud, and I had quietly folded that fortune into real estate holdings across the city, apartment complexes, warehouses, and a controlling stake in 3 separate companies, all of it managed through a private holding firm with my name nowhere visible on the letterhead. I did this deliberately. I had grown up poor, the son of a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and a father who left before I could walk, and I had promised myself that if I ever became wealthy, I would never let money change the way people looked at me, spoke to me, or loved me. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I had. So when I met Bridget Caro at a small diner on the edge of town, waitressing her way through community college with tired eyes and an easy laugh, I let her believe I was exactly what I appeared to be. A hard-working, unremarkable man with dust on his boots and calluses on his hands. For the first 4 years of our marriage, that quiet life felt like enough. Bridget was warm then, genuinely warm, the kind of woman who would leave a note in my lunch bag or save the last piece of pie for me even when she wanted it herself. We didn't have much, or so she believed, and we built a rhythm around that scarcity, clipping coupons together on Sunday mornings, splitting a single milkshake at the drive-in on our anniversary because that's what we could afford. I loved her plainly and completely, and for a long while, I told myself the secret I carried was a kindness, a shield protecting something fragile and real from the corrupting weight of money. But somewhere around our 7th year together, something in Bridget began to shift, slowly at first, like a crack forming in a windshield that you don't notice until the whole thing shatters at once. She started comparing our lives to her sister Colleen's, who had married a regional bank manager and lived in a house with a 2-car garage and a kitchen island. She started asking why we couldn't take a real vacation, why we still drove a truck with over 200,000 miles on it, why I never seemed interested in getting ahead. I would deflect gently, telling her that we had everything we needed, that our love didn't require granite countertops to be real. She would go quiet after those conversations, but the quiet never felt peaceful anymore. It felt like waiting. The morning everything broke apart started like any other. I had been asked to attend a routine walkthrough at one of the residential developments I owned, though of course my presence there looked, to any outside eye, like nothing more than a supervisor checking on a job site. I kissed Bridget on the forehead before I left, and she barely looked up from her phone, scrolling through photos that Colleen had posted of a beach vacation in Turks and Caicos. I remember the particular heaviness in the room, a kind of silent resentment that had become so familiar I almost didn't notice it anymore. I told her I loved her. She said nothing back. I told myself it was just a bad morning, the kind every marriage has, and I left for what I thought would be an ordinary day. I was wrong. That was the day the fault line beneath our marriage finally gave way completely, and it happened not in the privacy of our home but on the sidewalk in front of it, in view of at least 4 of our neighbors who happened to be watering their lawns or walking their dogs at exactly the wrong moment. I had come home a few hours earlier than expected because the site visit finished ahead of schedule, and as I pulled into the driveway in my old truck, I saw Bridget standing outside with her arms crossed, phone still in hand, her face flushed with an anger I hadn't seen directed at me before, not like this. Before I could even open the truck door, she was already speaking, her voice loud enough that I saw Mrs. Alvarez next door freeze mid-motion with her garden hose still running. Bridget told me she was done. Done pretending that we were building toward something. Done watching Colleen's life get bigger while ours stayed exactly, humiliatingly the same. She said she deserved a man who could actually provide, not a broke loser who was content to rot away in a rented house with a dead-end job and delusions of contentment. The words "broke loser" left her mouth like they had been sitting there for months, maybe years, waiting for the right amount of pressure to force them out. And then, before I could say a single word, she pulled the wedding ring from her finger, the one I had saved for 8 months to buy back when we were newly engaged, and I still wanted, more than anything, to give her something with my own 2 hands rather than simply write a check, and she threw it into the gutter at the edge of our driveway, where it bounced once against the curb and disappeared into a thin trickle of rainwater from the sprinklers down the street. I did not chase after the ring. I did not raise my voice. I stood there in the afternoon sun, feeling the eyes of our neighbors on me, feeling a strange, aching stillness settle over my chest, and I said only that I was sorry she felt that way, and that I hoped she would feel differently once she'd had time to think. She scoffed, told me not to bother following her inside, and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the front window. I stood on that sidewalk for what felt like a long time, staring at the spot in the gutter where the ring had vanished, and I felt something inside me that I hadn't expected to feel, not rage, not humiliation, but a quiet, sorrowful clarity. For years, I had told myself that hiding my wealth was an act of love, a way of protecting the purity of what Bridget and I had. But standing there, I understood for the first time that I had also been protecting myself. I had built a wall of secrecy so thick that even the woman who shared my bed had no idea who she was truly sleeping beside, and in that absence of truth, resentment had been allowed to grow unchecked, twisting her perception of me into something smaller and lesser than what was real. I could have told her, at any point over those 11 years, the truth of what I owned, what I had built, what I could have given her without blinking. I hadn't, because some part of me had wanted to be loved without conditions, and instead what I had built was a marriage without honesty, which is its own kind of poverty, no matter how much money sits quietly in the bank. I did not go inside that night. Instead, I walked 2 blocks to a small park near our house, sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, and called the one person who had known my secret from the very beginning, my closest friend and former business partner, a sharp, kind-hearted man named Walter Pemberton, who had helped me build the very fortune I had spent over a decade hiding. Walter answered on the second ring, and when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a long moment before he said something I have never forgotten. He said that money reveals people, but it doesn't create who they are underneath, it only removes the excuses that were covering the truth. He told me that Bridget's words on that sidewalk had not been caused by money or the lack of it, but by something that had been growing in her for a long time, and that the real question I needed to sit with wasn't whether I should reveal my wealth to prove her wrong, but whether the marriage itself, stripped of assumptions and secrets, still had something worth saving underneath it all. I sat on that bench until the sun began sinking low over the rooftops, thinking about Bridget as she had been when we first met, laughing behind the diner counter, genuinely delighted by small things, before comparison and resentment had eaten away at whatever peace she'd once carried. I thought about the woman who had cried tears of real joy when I proposed with a ring I'd paid for in cash I'd earned washing dishes on weekends before the business ever took off, long before either of us knew what my life would become. I wanted, more than anything, to believe that woman was still somewhere inside the person who had just called me a broke loser in front of our neighbors. I decided that before I did anything else, before pride or hurt could make the decision for me, I needed to find out. I did not go home to confront her with the truth of who I was. Instead, over the following days, I did something quieter, something I believe now was the turning point of the entire story. I stayed at Walter's guest house, giving Bridget the space she seemed to want, and I let her believe, for a short while longer, that I truly was the man she described on that sidewalk, a broke, directionless husband she was ready to leave behind. I wanted to see, without the distortion of money hanging in the air between us, what she would do next, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to understand the shape of her heart before I decided whether to reveal the shape of my life. During that time, I heard through mutual friends that Bridget had gone to stay with her sister Colleen, and that she had told anyone who would listen that she was finally free of a man who had wasted her best years chasing nothing. I heard that she'd started looking at apartments she could barely afford on her salary alone, driven by a kind of desperate optimism that leaving me would somehow open the door to the life she believed she deserved. It would have been easy, in that period, to feel only anger toward her, but instead I found myself feeling something closer to grief for the years we had spent slowly drifting from each other while pretending the distance wasn't there, grief for the truth I had withheld, and grief for a marriage that had quietly been dying long before that morning on the sidewalk made it undeniable. It was during this same week that fate, or perhaps simply the ordinary turning of the world, brought Bridget face to face with the truth in a way I never could have engineered myself. Colleen's husband, the regional bank manager whose success Bridget had measured our marriage against for years, worked at the very branch that managed several of my holding company's business accounts. One afternoon, while Bridget was venting to her sister in the kitchen about how foolish she'd been to waste so many years on a man with no ambition, Colleen's husband came home early and mentioned, entirely by accident, that his branch had just processed an enormous quarterly transfer for a client whose name he wasn't supposed to disclose but whose face he recognized instantly from a framed photograph in Colleen's living room, a photograph of Bridget and me at our wedding. He hadn't meant to reveal anything. He simply assumed, reasonably, that Bridget already knew the truth about the empire her husband quietly controlled. When he said my name aloud, connected to numbers so large that Bridget initially thought he'd misspoken, the room apparently went completely silent. Colleen later told me, once enough time had passed that we could speak civilly again, that Bridget's face had gone pale, then flushed, then pale again, as the full weight of what she'd thrown away in that gutter began to dawn on her, not just a ring, but a truth she had never bothered to look closely enough to see. Bridget called me 3 days later. I almost didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I genuinely did not know what version of her would be on the other end of that call, the wounded woman looking for reconciliation, or the embarrassed woman looking to reclaim access to a fortune she now realized she'd nearly lost. When I finally picked up, her voice was trembling in a way I hadn't heard since the early years of our relationship, back when she still allowed herself to be soft in front of me. She asked, very quietly, if it was true. I told her the truth, plainly, without embellishment or excuse. I told her about the company Walter and I had built from nothing, about the sale that had changed my life financially while I chose deliberately not to let it change how I lived. I told her about the properties, the holding company, the reasons I had kept it hidden, not to deceive her cruelly, but because I had wanted, desperately, to be loved for the man underneath the money rather than for the money itself. There was a long silence on the line after I finished speaking, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked, and she asked me the question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure: why hadn't I trusted her enough to tell her the truth? I told her, as gently as I could, that trust is something built in both directions, and that over the last several years, what I had felt from her more often than warmth was a growing hunger for a life she believed we couldn't afford, a hunger that had slowly turned into contempt for the man she thought couldn't provide it. I told her that if I had revealed my wealth earlier, I feared it wouldn't have healed the resentment growing between us, it would have simply given it somewhere new to attach itself. What followed was not an instant reconciliation, because real stories, the honest kind, are rarely that simple. Bridget asked if we could meet, and I agreed, but I insisted that we meet not in some grand restaurant or expensive setting that might color the conversation with the very thing that had broken us, but at the small diner on the edge of town where we had first met all those years ago, the one still run by the same owner, still smelling faintly of coffee and fryer oil, still holding, somehow, the ghost of who we used to be before either of us knew what the years would do to us. We sat across from each other in a corner booth on a bright, ordinary afternoon, sunlight cutting long lines across the table between us, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, we spoke to each other without pretense. Bridget cried, not performatively, but in the raw, exhausted way of someone finally confronting the truth of their own choices. She told me she was ashamed, not simply because she had misjudged the size of our bank account, but because she realized, sitting there, that she had let comparison and resentment slowly poison something that had once been genuinely good between us. She admitted that watching Colleen's life had done something quiet and corrosive to her over the years, that she had begun to measure her own worth by the size of her sister's house rather than the substance of her own marriage, and that the words she'd spoken on that sidewalk, the broke loser, the dismissal of everything I had built with my hands regardless of what it was worth on paper, had come from a place of fear and shame rather than truth. She said she understood if I could never look at her the same way again, and that she wasn't asking for forgiveness because she felt entitled to it, only because she genuinely wanted, for the first time in years, to become someone worth forgiving. I did not tell her, in that moment, that everything was suddenly fine, because it wasn't, and I have never believed that real healing happens in a single conversation no matter how honest it is. Instead, I told her that if we were going to attempt to rebuild anything between us, it would have to be built on a foundation neither of us had ever actually used before, complete honesty, on both sides, about who we were and what we feared and what we truly valued. I told her I forgave her for the words on the sidewalk, not because they hadn't hurt, they had, deeply, in front of neighbors who would probably remember it for years, but because I understood, watching her cry in that booth, that pain doesn't excuse cruelty but it does explain it, and that the woman across from me was not a villain, only a person who had lost her way inside her own comparisons and had been given, through painful circumstance, a chance to find it again. I told her that I would help her retrieve the ring, not because a piece of jewelry mattered more than the truth we now had to build together, but because I wanted her to hold it again only once she had decided, clearly and for herself, that she wanted the man who had given it to her, not the fortune that man happened to possess. We went together that same afternoon, in the fading gold light of early evening, back to the gutter outside our old house, and we searched, both of us on our knees on the pavement while Mrs. Alvarez watched curiously from her porch, until Bridget's fingers finally closed around the ring where it had lodged against a storm drain grate, dulled with a week of dust and rainwater but entirely intact. She held it in her palm for a long moment, staring at it the way you might look at an old photograph that suddenly reveals a detail you never noticed before, and then she looked up at me, her eyes red and raw, and asked if I would put it back on her finger myself, the way I had the very first time. I told her I wasn't ready to do that yet, not out of punishment, but out of respect for what real forgiveness requires, and I explained that a ring meant nothing if the trust behind it hadn't actually been repaired, and that trust, real trust, takes longer to rebuild than a single afternoon of tears in a diner booth, however sincere. She nodded, understanding in a way that surprised me, and she said she was willing to wait, willing to prove through actions rather than words that the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago hadn't disappeared entirely, only gotten lost beneath years of comparison and quiet resentment she hadn't known how to name. The months that followed were not glamorous or dramatic in the way people often imagine reconciliation to be. There were no lavish gifts, no sudden mansion, no public unveiling of my wealth to prove a point to anyone who had witnessed that ugly morning on the sidewalk. Instead, Bridget and I began meeting regularly, first as something closer to careful friends than spouses, talking honestly about the years we had let slip past without truly seeing each other. She began seeing a counselor on her own, not because I demanded it, but because she said she wanted to understand why her sister's life had come to mean more to her than the reality of her own, and why she had let something as hollow as a bigger garage or a fancier vacation photo convince her that the man beside her wasn't enough. I, in turn, began confronting the ways my own silence had contributed to the distance between us, the way hiding my wealth, however well-intentioned, had also been a way of hiding myself, of never fully trusting her with the whole truth of who I was, which is its own kind of quiet dishonesty even when no lie is ever spoken aloud. Slowly, over the course of that summer, something in our relationship that had been buried under years of unspoken resentment began, cautiously, to breathe again. I want to be honest and say that I did not rush to shower Bridget with the trappings of the fortune she had once mocked me for supposedly lacking. Instead, the changes we made were smaller and, I believe, more meaningful. I began involving her, slowly, in decisions about the holding company and the properties I managed, not to impress her, but because I wanted our marriage, if it was going to continue, to be built on shared understanding rather than separate secrets. She surprised me during this process, showing an instinct for people and fairness that I hadn't fully appreciated before, suggesting, unprompted, that a portion of our resources go toward renovating affordable housing units in the very neighborhood where the diner still stood, the neighborhood where we had both grown up without much, before either of us had anything at all. Watching her advocate for families who reminded her of who she used to be, rather than pushing for the kind of visible luxury she had once craved, was, for me, the clearest sign that something real was shifting inside her, not performative repentance, but genuine change. There is a particular afternoon from that autumn that I still think about often, one that I believe marks the true turning point of everything that came after. Bridget and I had gone back to the small park near our old house, the same park where I had sat alone on a bench the night everything fell apart, and we walked slowly along the path beneath trees just beginning to turn color, the late afternoon sun slanting warm and low through the branches. She had been quiet for a while, turning the ring over and over in her jacket pocket, a habit she'd developed in the months since we'd found it in the gutter, and finally she stopped walking, turned to face me, and said that she didn't want the ring back because of what it represented financially, and she didn't want it back to undo the shame of that morning in front of the neighbors. She said she wanted it back because, for the first time in years, she finally understood what it had always actually meant, not a symbol of provision or status, but a promise from a man who had loved her enough, even in his silence, to spend 8 months of dishwashing wages just to place something meaningful on her finger before either of them knew what the future held. She said she was ready, whenever I was, to wear that promise again, not as a woman who had been caught chasing the wrong things, but as a woman who had finally learned, through painful and public failure, what actually mattered. I did not answer her right away. Instead, I reached into my own pocket, where I had been carrying that same ring for weeks, waiting, without telling her, for a moment that felt honest enough to deserve it, and I knelt down on the gravel path in the golden light of that ordinary afternoon, and I asked her, plainly, without any grand speech, if she would let me place it back on her hand, not as the broke loser she had once called me, and not as the wealthy man she had since discovered I secretly was, but simply as Arthur, the same man who had loved her since the day she poured his coffee behind a diner counter with a laugh that made the whole room feel warmer. She cried then, harder than she had in the booth weeks earlier, and she said yes, and I slid the ring back onto her finger while an elderly couple walking their dog paused a respectful distance away, smiling at a scene they couldn't have possibly understood the full weight of, and for the first time in longer than either of us could admit, the quiet between us felt like peace instead of distance. If this story has touched something in you, I hope you'll take a moment to leave a comment about the lesson that stayed with you most, whether it's about the danger of comparison, the quiet damage of unspoken truths, or the power of forgiveness to rebuild something that once seemed permanently broken, because stories like this one only continue to reach the people who need them most when we share our honest reflections with each other. We did not tell our neighbors the details of what had happened behind closed doors in the months that followed, though Mrs. Alvarez, I suspect, pieced together more than she ever let on from her porch chair. We simply began, quietly and deliberately, to live differently, not richer in any way our neighbors could see, still driving that same dented truck for another 2 years out of habit and sentiment more than necessity, but richer in the ways that actually matter, in honesty, in patience, in the willingness to keep choosing each other even after the worst version of a relationship had already been spoken aloud on a public sidewalk. Bridget went on, in time, to help me establish a small foundation focused on housing support for families in Millbrook who reminded us both of where we'd started, and she often says now that the gutter where she once threw her ring in anger became, unexpectedly, the exact place where she found her way back to who she truly wanted to be. Colleen and Bridget's relationship healed slowly too, no longer built on quiet competition but on something gentler, once Bridget stopped measuring her own life against a life that was never actually hers to live. As for me, I still keep one of my old flannel shirts in the closet, worn thin at the elbows, not because I need it, but because it reminds me of a version of myself who once believed that hiding the truth was the safest way to protect love, before I learned, through the hardest morning of my life, that real love isn't protected by secrecy at all, it's protected by the courage to be fully known, flaws, fortune, and all, by the one person you've chosen to walk beside. If you believe, as I have come to believe, that people are capable of change, that pride can soften into humility, and that even the deepest wounds between two people can heal into something stronger than before, then I hope you'll like this video, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of that hope today, leave a comment about what stayed with you, and subscribe to our channel so you're here with our family and our community for the next story, because somewhere out there, someone is standing on their own version of that sidewalk right now, wondering if there's still a way back to who they used to be, and the truth is, more often than we think, there always is.